The winter wind whistled through the empty Chicago streets as Officer Wilson finished her late-night patrol. The city had been unusually quiet that November evening, with only a few calls about minor disturbances. Just as she was about to head back to the station, a faint cry caught her attention. At first, she thought it might be a stray cat. She'd seen plenty of those in her 8 years on the force. But something about this sound made her stop the patrol car and step out into the biting cold. The cry came again, clearer this time, definitely human and definitely a baby. Her heart racing, she followed the sound to a narrow alley between two brick buildings. The shadows seemed darker here, and her flashlight beam cut through the gloom like a knife. Behind a rusty dumpster, partially hidden by cardboard boxes, lay a small bundle wrapped in what looked like an old fleece blanket. "Please no," she whispered to herself, already knowing what she'd find. The bundle moved slightly, and 2 tiny fists pushed against the blanket. A 6-month-old baby boy, his dark skin almost blue from the cold, looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world. Officer Wilson didn't hesitate. She scooped up the infant, her training kicking in as she checked his vital signs. He was cold, too cold, but breathing steadily. As she cradled him close to share her body heat, she radioed for backup and medical assistance. The baby grabbed her finger with surprising strength, and in that moment, something shifted in her world. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The hospital staff worked quickly to treat the baby for exposure and dehydration. Officer Wilson stayed well past her shift, filling out paperwork and making calls to child services. She couldn't shake the image of those eyes looking up at her, couldn't stop wondering about the desperate circumstances that would lead someone to abandon such a precious child. Days turned into weeks as she checked on the baby's case. She learned he was healthy despite his ordeal, but no one had come forward to claim him. Each visit to the temporary foster home where he'd been placed felt like a tug on her heart. She'd seen countless tragic situations in her line of work, but this one was different. This one followed her home at night, made her question everything about her single, career-focused life. Other officers noticed how she'd light up when talking about the baby, how she'd use her lunch breaks to visit him. Her partner even caught her looking at adoption websites on her phone between calls. "You're falling for him, aren't you?" he asked one day, no judgment in his voice, just understanding. The truth was, she already had fallen. Every time the baby smiled at her, every time he fell asleep in her arms during visits, she felt less like a police officer who had found an abandoned child and more like a mother who had found her son. But the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her mind. She was white, single, worked unpredictable hours, and had no experience as a mother. Would she be doing right by this child? One evening, while rocking the baby to sleep at the foster home, she overheard 2 social workers discussing how difficult it would be to place a black child with his ideal matching family, given his unknown background. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny hand reaching up to touch her face, and in that moment, she made her decision. Love didn't need to match. Love just needed to be real, committed, and strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test her heart, challenge her assumptions, and ultimately redefine her understanding of what makes a family. The social worker's office felt smaller than usual that morning as Officer Wilson sat nervously twisting her hands in her lap. 6 weeks had passed since she found the baby boy behind that dumpster, and here she was, about to change both their lives forever. The walls were covered with cheerful posters about family and love, but her mind kept racing through all the reasons people might think she wasn't the right choice. "Are you sure about this?" the social worker asked gently, sliding the preliminary adoption paperwork across the desk. Single-parent adoption is challenging enough, but transracial adoption brings its own unique set of responsibilities. The social worker wasn't trying to discourage her. She just needed to be sure this police officer understood what she was taking on. Officer Wilson took a deep breath. "I've thought about nothing else for weeks," she replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I know it won't be easy. I know some people won't understand. But when I look at him," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "When I look at him, I don't see a black baby or a white mother. I see my son, the one I was meant to find that night." The next few months were a whirlwind of home studies, background checks, and parenting classes. Her fellow officers rallied around her, helping to baby-proof her small house and collecting gently used baby items. Her mother, though initially concerned about the challenges, quickly fell in love with the idea of becoming a grandmother and started knitting tiny sweaters in every color imaginable. The police department worked with her to adjust her schedule, moving her to a more family-friendly shift. Her partner even connected her with his sister, who ran a daycare center near the station. Slowly but surely, the pieces started falling into place. But not everyone was as supportive. At the grocery store, she noticed the sideways glances when she pushed the baby's stroller. At the park, other mothers sometimes pulled their children away, making assumptions about who she was and why she had a black child. Each incident stung, but it only made her more determined to create a world where her son would feel proud of who he was and where he came from. She began doing research, reading books about transracial adoption, joining online support groups, and connecting with other families like hers. She learned about the importance of maintaining cultural connections and celebrating her son's heritage. A retired black officer from her precinct became a close family friend, offering both guidance and a vital link to the community. The day the adoption became final was both joyous and sobering. As she held her son in the courthouse, now officially his mother, she made a silent promise. She would never try to erase his history or pretend race didn't matter. Instead, she would help him embrace all parts of his identity, teaching him that family is built on love, understanding, and commitment. That evening, as she rocked him to sleep in the nursery she painted herself, she thought about all the changes the past few months had brought. Her life was different now, messier, more complicated, filled with both challenges and infinite joy. The baby snuggled closer, his breath warm against her neck, completely trusting and unaware of the complex world he'd been born into. Her friend from the forest had asked her earlier that day if she ever regretted her decision, especially given the obstacles they'd face. Looking down at her sleeping son, his tiny fingers curled around her thumb, she knew the answer with absolute certainty. Some people might never understand their family, but that was okay. They had found each other in that dark alley for a reason, and together they would write their own story of belonging. As she placed him gently in his crib, she whispered the same words she'd been saying every night since he came home. "You are loved, you are wanted, and you are exactly where you're supposed to be." What she didn't know then was that their greatest challenges, and most powerful moments of connection, still lay ahead. 5 years flew by in a blur of first steps, first words, and countless precious moments. Officer Wilson watched her son grow from that tiny baby she found into a bright, curious kindergartner with an infectious laugh and endless questions about everything. But with each passing year, those questions grew more complex, especially about their unique family. One sunny afternoon, while they were coloring together at the kitchen table, he looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes that always seemed to see right through to her soul. "Why don't I look like you, Mom?" he asked, holding up his arm next to hers to compare their skin tones. Her heart squeezed, but she'd been preparing for this moment. "Because love doesn't have to match on the outside," she explained, pulling him onto her lap. "Remember how I told you I found you when you were very tiny? God made us different colors, but He made our hearts the same." She hugged him close, feeling his small body relax against hers. "And that's what makes us family, the love in our hearts." But navigating their differences wasn't always as simple as a kitchen table conversation. At his new school, some kids made comments that left him confused and hurt. One day, he came home quiet and withdrawn. It turned out a classmate had told him Officer Wilson couldn't be his real mom because they didn't look alike. That evening, she sat with him on their porch swing, his favorite spot for serious talks. She explained how families come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. She showed him pictures of other families like theirs that she'd collected, helping him see they weren't alone. His smile slowly returned as they looked through the photos together. Her police work actually helped in unexpected ways. She used her experiences helping different kinds of people to teach him about diversity and acceptance. When he visited the station, her fellow officers, a mix of races and backgrounds, treated him like their own, showing him that family could extend beyond blood ties. She made sure their home celebrated his heritage. Their walls displayed art from Black artists. Their bookshelves held stories about Black heroes and everyday experiences of Black families. She learned to care for his hair properly, spending Sunday afternoons making it their special bonding time. A kind barber at the local Black-owned barbershop became another important figure in their lives, offering both haircuts and cultural wisdom. Sometimes, people's stares in public spaces still hurt. But Officer Wilson had learned to handle these moments with grace and strength, teaching her son to do the same. Some people just don't understand that love makes a family, she'd tell them. But that's their problem, not ours. Their favorite ritual became their nightly gratitude game. While tucking him in, they'd each share 3 things they were thankful for that day. His answers often surprised and touched her. I'm thankful for my brown skin because it's beautiful like chocolate. Or, I'm thankful you found me that night. One evening, during their game, he said something that brought tears to her eyes. I'm thankful that even though you're not my birth mom, you chose to be my forever mom. She held him extra tight that night, knowing there would be more challenges ahead, but feeling confident they could face them together. Through it all, she kept learning and growing alongside him. She joined a support group for transracial adoptive parents, where she could openly discuss her fears and uncertainties. She built connections with Black families in their community, ensuring her son had role models who looked like him. Most importantly, she kept the conversation open, always ready to listen and learn. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was perfectly theirs. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every proud moment at school events reminded her that love truly does build the strongest families. What she didn't realize was that their biggest test was still to come. One that would shake their foundation, but ultimately make it stronger. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning at the police station. Officer Wilson was finishing up some paperwork when her supervisor handed her the envelope, his expression unusually serious. "This came for you," he said softly. "It's about your son." Her hands trembled as she opened the letter. The paper inside was crumpled, as if someone had written and rewritten it many times. As she read the first lines, her heart seemed to stop. "I believe I am the father of the baby you found 7 years ago." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. The writer explained how his wife had suffered from severe postpartum depression, how she'd disappeared with their baby one night and never returned, how she'd passed away months later without telling anyone what she'd done with their child. He'd spent years searching, following every possible lead, until a news article about a police officer adopting an abandoned baby had given him hope. Officer Wilson sat in her patrol car during lunch break, reading the letter for the 10th time. The man's words were filled with pain, regret, and longing. He didn't want to disrupt their lives, he wrote, but he needed to know if this was his son. He included his contact information and a photo of himself holding a newborn, a baby who looked remarkably like her son. That evening, she couldn't focus on their usual dinner conversation. Her boy chatted about his day at school, completely unaware that his world might be about to change. She watched him eat his spaghetti, saw how he twirled the noodles just like she'd taught him, and felt a fear she'd never known before. Later, after tucking him in, she called her mother. "What if I lose him?" she whispered, finally letting out the sobs she'd been holding back all day. Her mother listened patiently, then asked, "What would you want if you were in his father's shoes?" Sleep didn't come easily that night. She tossed and turned, remembering all the moments they'd shared. His first steps across their living room floor, The way he insisted on wearing his police officer costume for 3 straight days last Halloween. How he still crawled into her bed during thunderstorms. The thought of losing any of it was unbearable. But as she lay there in the dark, another thought kept creeping in. Her son had always asked questions about where he came from, who he looked like. She'd promised herself she'd always put his needs first. Could she deny him the chance to know his birth father, his history, his roots? The next morning, she contacted the family court lawyer who'd handled the adoption. After verifying the letter writer's identity, they discovered his story checked out completely. He had indeed filed missing person reports for both his wife and child. He'd never stopped searching. He'd rebuilt his life, remarried, had 2 more children, but had never given up hope of finding his firstborn. A background check revealed he was stable, employed, and by all accounts, a good father to his other children. The lawyer explained that given the circumstances of abandonment and the proper adoption procedures followed, her parental rights were secure. But the weight of the decision still felt overwhelming. Her son noticed something was wrong. During their bedtime routine, he asked, "Are you sad, Mom?" She pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his freshly washed hair. "No, baby," she said. "I'm just thinking about how much I love you." That night, she made her decision. She would tell him about the letter, about his birth father wanting to meet him. It would be scary, it would be hard, but she knew it was right. Their love was strong enough to handle this truth, just like it had handled everything else. As she wrote her response letter, her hands were steady. "Your son is healthy, happy, and very loved," she began. "And if you're ready, we would like to meet you." She knew this choice might change everything, but sometimes love meant being brave enough to open your heart wider than you thought possible. The days after sending her response felt like the longest of Officer Wilson's life. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, second-guessing her decision. During her patrol shifts, her mind would wander to thoughts of the upcoming meeting. What would her son's birth father be like? How would her boy react? Would this change everything they'd built together? She decided to tell her son about the letter on a Saturday morning. They were sitting in their favorite spot in the backyard, where they'd planted a small garden together. As he helped her pull weeds from around their tomato plants, she took a deep breath and started the conversation she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head. "Remember how we've talked about your birth parents?" She began gently, watching his small hands pat the soil. "About how sometimes life is complicated, and grown-ups make hard choices." He nodded, his attention now fully on her face. "Well, sweetheart, something amazing has happened. Your birth father has been looking for you all these years, and he finally found us." His eyes went wide, a mix of emotions crossing his face, confusion, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite read. Is he nice?" he asked in a small voice. She showed him the photo from the letter, her heart aching as she watched him study the face of the man who shared his features. "From what I know, yes, he's very nice," she answered honestly. "And he's been missing you for a very long time. Would you like to meet him?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. After what felt like forever, he nodded slowly, then wrapped his arms around her neck. "But you're still my real mom, right?" Her eyes filled with tears as she held him tight. "Always and forever, baby. Nothing will ever change that. Meeting your birth father just means you'll have more people to love you." But even as she said the words, her own fears gnawed at her heart. That evening, she called the family counselor they'd worked with before. Together, they made a plan for how to handle the meeting, how to prepare her son, and most importantly, how to protect his emotional well-being through this process. The counselor reminded her that children can handle difficult truths when they're delivered with love and support. As the meeting date approached, Officer Wilson noticed changes in her son. He became more thoughtful, asking questions about his birth father's other children, his half-siblings. "Do you think they'll like me?" he asked one night during bedtime. "Do they look like me?" She answered as honestly as she could, reminding him that no matter what happened, their own little family would stay strong. Her fellow officers at the station became her support system. Her partner covered her shifts when she needed time for counseling sessions. The precinct captain, who'd watched her journey from that first night she found the baby, made sure she had whatever time she needed to handle this situation. One evening, while sorting through old photos, her son found the newspaper clipping about the night she discovered him. "You saved my life," he said simply, climbing into her lap. She held him close, remembering that cold night that had changed both their lives forever. "No, baby," she whispered. "You saved mine." The night before the scheduled meeting, neither of them could sleep. They ended up in the kitchen at midnight, making hot chocolate and talking about their fears. "What if he doesn't like me?" her son whispered. "What if he wants me to go live with him?" She pulled him onto her lap, even though he was getting almost too big for it now. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "You are my son, and I am your mother. Nothing can change that. Your birth father wants to know you because he loves you too. And love isn't like a pie. Having more doesn't mean each piece gets smaller. It just means your heart grows bigger." As she finally tucked him into bed, she realized something important. This wasn't just about her fears anymore. It was about giving her son the gift of knowing all of who he was, where he came from, and how many people loved him. Tomorrow would change their lives again, but just like that night 7 years ago, she would face it with courage and love. The family counseling center felt warm and welcoming, but Officer Wilson's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she parked her car. Her son sat quietly in the backseat, wearing his favorite blue shirt and new sneakers. He wanted to look nice for today. They were 30 minutes early for the meeting, but she needed this extra time to gather her courage. "Ready, buddy?" she asked, catching his eye in the rearview mirror. He nodded bravely, though she could see him fidgeting with his shirt buttons. They walked hand in hand into the building, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The counselor met them at the door with a gentle smile, leading them to a comfortable room filled with soft chairs and colorful artwork. "Your birth father and his wife are already here," the counselor explained softly. "They're in another room. We'll bring them in when you're both ready." Her son's grip on her hand tightened. They sat together on a plush couch, and she noticed how his legs didn't quite reach the floor yet. He still seemed so small for such a big moment. The minutes ticked by slowly. The counselor talked them through what would happen, but Officer Wilson found herself struggling to focus. All she could think about was protecting her son's heart. Then, a soft knock at the door made them both jump slightly. The man who walked in was tall, with kind eyes that immediately welled up with tears when he saw the boy. His wife stood slightly behind him, her hand supportively on his back. But Officer Wilson couldn't take her eyes off her son's face as he saw his birth father for the first time. The resemblance was striking. They had the same nose, the same way of tilting their head when curious. "Ty," the man said softly, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've been dreaming about meeting you for so long." He stayed near the door, respecting their space, but his eyes never left the child's face. Officer Wilson felt her son press closer to her side, suddenly shy. The counselor gently guided them through the initial moments. They talked about simple things first: favorite colors, foods, what grade he was in at school. Slowly, very slowly, the tension began to ease. Her son's birth father pulled out some photos of his other children, and for the first time, her boy saw siblings who looked like him. "Would you like to see a picture of your birth mother?" he asked carefully, looking to Officer Wilson for permission first. She nodded, and he showed them a photo of a beautiful young woman with a bright smile. "She loved you very much," he said quietly. "She was sick in a way that doctors couldn't fix, but she loved you with all her heart." Her son studied the photo intently, then looked up at Officer Wilson with tears in his eyes. Without hesitation, she pulled him into a hug. "It's okay to feel sad," she whispered. "It's okay to have questions." His birth father watched them with respect and understanding, and in that moment, she realized he wasn't there to take her son away. He was there to add to his life, not subtract from it. As the meeting continued, something unexpected happened. The adults found themselves sharing stories, filling in the gaps of the past 7 years. Her son began to relax, even laugh a little as his birth father told a funny story about his half-siblings. His wife shared photos of their family dog, and soon they were all talking about pets. The counselor had prepared them for a short first meeting, but almost 2 hours passed before anyone noticed the time. When it was time to say goodbye, her son surprised everyone by giving his birth father a quick hug. "Can I see you again?" he asked, and the man's face lit up with joy. In the car ride home, her son was unusually quiet, processing everything that had happened. "Mom," he finally said as they pulled into their driveway. "I'm glad you're my mom. And I'm glad I got to meet him too." She had to wipe away tears before she could respond. That night, as she tucked him into bed, he asked more questions about his birth mother, about his siblings, about how families can change and grow. She answered each one as honestly as she could, marveling at his strength and openness. This day had been just the beginning of a new chapter in their story, but she felt more secure than ever in their bond. The months following that first meeting brought changes no one had quite expected. What started as carefully planned visits every few weeks slowly evolved into something more natural and comfortable. Officer Wilson watched as her son's world expanded, bringing with it both challenges and beautiful moments she never could have imagined. One Saturday morning, while dropping her son off for his visit with his birth father's family, she noticed how easily he ran to greet his half-siblings playing in the front yard. The youngest one, a 4-year-old girl, always called him Big Brother with such pride that it made her heart swell. His birth father's wife had become an unexpected ally, often texting Officer Wilson photos of the kids playing together or sharing funny stories from their visits. But not everything was simple. There were moments of confusion, like when her son came home quiet after a school project about family trees. "I didn't know which family to put," he admitted that evening, pushing his dinner around his plate. She pulled out paper and colored markers, and together they drew a special tree with extra branches, showing how love could grow in different directions. The first big test came during his birthday party. Officer Wilson had always hosted small celebrations, but this year was different. Both families would be there, and she worried about how others would react. Her police department friends, her mother, her son's birth father, and his family. Would they blend or stay in awkward separate groups? She needn't have worried. The party became a beautiful example of how love could bridge any gap. Her fellow officers chatted easily with his birth father about sports and work. The kids played together as if they'd known each other forever. Her mother, who'd initially been concerned about the whole situation, was in the kitchen swapping recipes with his birth father's wife. The most touching moment came when it was time for cake. Her son stood between both families as everyone sang, "Happy Birthday," his face glowing in the candlelight. Looking around the room, Officer Wilson saw nothing but joy and love directed at this little boy who had brought them all together. But there were still hurdles to overcome. One day, she overheard some mothers at school whispering about their complicated situation. Her son came home upset because a classmate had said it was weird to have two families. These moments tested her, but they also made her stronger in her conviction that they were doing the right thing. His birth father proved to be a true partner in navigating these challenges. When someone made an insensitive comment about their arrangement, he was the first to stand up and explain how modern families could look different but still be filled with love. He never tried to replace Officer Wilson as a parent. Instead, he always made sure to reinforce that she was mom, and he was just adding more love to their lives. They developed their own unique traditions. Sunday dinners became a regular thing, alternating between homes. The kids would play in the backyard while the adults prepared meals together, sharing stories and building bridges between their two worlds. His birth father taught him to play basketball, while Officer Wilson remained his go-to for homework help and bedtime stories. One evening, while watching all the children play together in the park, his birth father's wife turned to Officer Wilson with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being brave enough to let us in." Officer Wilson squeezed her hand, remembering all her initial fears about sharing her son's love. Those fears seemed so distant now. Their arrangement wasn't always perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when they had to navigate complicated feelings or conflicting schedules. But they faced each challenge with open hearts and honest conversations. They learned that family isn't about competing for love. It's about creating more of it. The biggest surprise came in how their unusual family structure affected others. Other adoptive parents began reaching out for advice. Their story started conversations in their community about what makes a family. Even some of Officer Wilson's colleagues changed their views about adoption and family bonds after seeing their success. As she watched her son grow more confident and secure in his expanded family circle, Officer Wilson realized they weren't just making it work. They were creating something beautiful and new. They were showing the world that love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies. Time has a way of changing things, and 3 years after that first meeting, their unique family had found its rhythm. The boy who was once abandoned behind a dumpster was now 12, growing tall and strong, with a confidence that came from knowing he was deeply loved by two families who had learned to work together. One ordinary Tuesday changed everything again. Officer Wilson was helping her son with his homework when he looked up suddenly, his expression serious. "Mom, I want to tell my story at school," he said. His class was having a special presentation day about what made their families unique, and he wanted to share his journey. Her heart skipped a beat. They'd always been open about his adoption within their circle, but speaking about it publicly felt different. "Are you sure?" she asked carefully. He nodded, his eyes bright with determination. "I want other kids to know it's okay to be different, and maybe it'll help someone else like me." That weekend, both families gathered at Officer Wilson's house to help him prepare his presentation. His birth father brought old photos, including some of his birth mother that they'd never seen before. As they sat around the kitchen table, sharing memories and piecing together his story, there were tears and laughter in equal measure. His little half-sister, now 7, insisted on drawing pictures to go with his presentation. "This is when you were a baby and Mom Officer found you," she explained, showing her crayon drawing of a police car and a bundle. Everyone smiled at her name for Officer Wilson. She'd come up with Mom Officer on her own, and somehow it had stuck. The morning of the presentation, both his birth father and Officer Wilson took time off work to attend. They sat in the back of the classroom, watching as their son stood confidently before his classmates. "My story starts on a cold night in Chicago," he began, his voice clear and strong, "when a police officer found a baby who needed a home." As he spoke, Officer Wilson watched his classmates' faces. There was no judgment, only fascination and empathy. He explained how his first mom had been very sick and made a desperate choice, how his second mom found him and chose him, and how his dad had never stopped looking for him. He talked about having two families who loved him and how that made him feel special, not different. "Some people think families have to match," he said, showing a photo of all of them at his last birthday party. "But my family matches in our hearts." The class erupted in applause when he finished. His teacher wiped away tears, and several parents who had stayed to watch came up to thank him for his bravery. That evening, they had a special celebration dinner. Both families came together, bringing his favorite dishes. As they sat around the table, his birth father raised his glass. "To our son," he said, looking at Officer Wilson with respect, "and to the amazing mother who kept him safe until we found each other again." Later, while helping with the dishes, his birth father's wife shared something that made Officer Wilson's eyes well up. "He told me yesterday that he feels lucky," she said softly. "Not everyone gets two moms and a dad who all love each other enough to put him first." The presentation had an unexpected impact at school. Other adopted kids started feeling more comfortable sharing their stories. The school counselor asked if they would be willing to talk to other families navigating similar situations. Their unusual family was becoming an example of how love could bridge any gap. That night, as Officer Wilson tucked her son into bed, yes, she still did that even though he claimed he was getting too old for it, he hugged her extra tight. "Thank you for finding me that night," he whispered. "And thank you for helping me find my birth father, too." She held him close, remembering the tiny baby she discovered years ago. "Thank you for making me a mom," she replied softly. "And for teaching me that love only grows bigger when you share it." As she turned out his light, she realized their story wasn't just about adoption or family anymore. It was about the courage to open your heart and let love write its own rules. High school graduation day arrived with all the promise and emotion such milestones bring. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, searching for the best spots to see their graduates. But there was one section that stood out, a blend of police officers in uniform, a proud grandmother clutching tissues, and a second family who shared the graduates' warm brown eyes and bright smile. The boy found behind a dumpster had grown into an impressive young man. As he adjusted his cap in the mirror that morning, Officer Wilson had stood in his doorway, hardly able to believe how quickly time had passed. He'd grown taller than her now, his shoulders broad and strong, but his heart remained as gentle as ever. He'd been chosen to give a speech as class president, something that filled both his families with pride. As he stepped up to the podium, Officer Wilson felt her birth father reach across the aisle to squeeze her hand. A gesture that would have seemed impossible years ago, but now felt completely natural. "When people ask me about my family," he began, his voice clear and confident, "I tell them I'm the luckiest kid in the world because I have two." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the crowd. "My story started on a cold night when a police officer found an abandoned baby. That officer became my mom, and she taught me that love is a choice we make every day." He spoke about how his birth father never gave up searching for him, about the day they finally found each other, and how two families learned to become one. "Some people think having two families must be complicated," he continued. "But I've learned that love isn't like a piece of pie that gets smaller when you share it. It's like a light that only grows brighter when you add more to it." From her seat, Officer Wilson could see several of her fellow officers wiping away tears. The chief of police, who'd supported her through the adoption all those years ago, sat tall and proud. Her son had spent countless hours at the station growing up, becoming a beloved part of their law enforcement family too. "My birth mother made an impossible choice that night," he said softly, touching on a subject they'd all come to terms with over the years. "She was fighting battles we'll never fully understand. But her choice led me to my mom, who taught me that being a parent isn't about blood. It's about love, sacrifice, and showing up every day." He spoke about his siblings, about having a brother and sisters who shared his features and his laugh, about how his birth father's wife had become another mother figure in his life, never trying to replace Officer Wilson, but adding her own kind of love to their unique family tapestry. "Today, as we graduate and step into our futures, we're all thinking about family," he continued. "Some of us have traditional families, some have chosen families, and some, like me, have been blessed with both. What I've learned is that family isn't about matching looks or sharing DNA. It's about the people who choose to love you, support you, and stand by you no matter what." As he concluded his speech, he looked directly at where both his families sat together. "To my mom, who found me that night and chose to make me her son, thank you for teaching me that love knows no boundaries. To my birth father, who never stopped searching, thank you for showing me that hope never dies. And to all the people who helped turn our unusual situation into something beautiful, thank you for proving that family is what we make it." The applause was thunderous. Officer Wilson found herself surrounded by hugs from both families, all of them sharing in this moment of triumph. Her son's journey from abandoned infant to confident graduate hadn't been easy, but together they created something remarkable. A family bound not by blood, but by choice, understanding, and endless love. Later that evening, at the celebration party in their backyard, she watched as he moved easily between both families, sharing jokes with his siblings, hugging his grandmother, high-fiving fellow officers' kids. His birth father caught her eye across the yard and raised his glass in a silent toast. They had done it. They had put their child first and created a new kind of family that worked beautifully in its own unique way. As the sun set on this chapter of their lives, Officer Wilson realized their story had become more than just an adoption tale. It had become a testament to the power of love, the strength of forgiveness, and the beautiful possibilities that open up when people choose to put a child's happiness above their own fears and doubts.